Okay. Very good evening and also good morning. Welcome to the International Roundtable on Digital Media and Cybersecurity Debates in US-India Relations, organized by Rising Powers Initiative, Elliott School of International Affairs, George Washington University, in collaboration with Department of International Studies, Political Science and History, Christ University. On behalf of all the partner institutions, I extend hearty welcome to Dr. Father Jose CC, Dr. Deepa Olapalli, Director, Rising Powers Initiative, and moderator for this particular roundtable. It is also our privilege to welcome distinguished speakers of this particular roundtable, Dr. Christopher Painter, who is President, the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise Foundation, Ambassador Lata Reddy, co-chair the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace, Dr. J. Gullish, head of Digital Economy Committee, Media and Entertainment Committee and Privacy Working Group, US-India Business Council, and Dr. Jurjit Pal, who will be joining in a while. He is presently Associate Professor, School of Information, University of Michigan, and also my colleagues at the department, Dr. Madhumati Deshpande and other colleagues, and also all the distinguished members who are at the audience, and my dear student panelists and students. You all know that this is the third segment of the initiative that we commenced a year back. This is, we had firstly the conference and then the workshop, and this is the third roundtable. Few announcements before we proceed. Keep your mics muted when the proceedings are on. Feel free to send in your questions and comments, whatever you have, through chat box. We will take it up and address. Moderator will take care. And at the end of the session, you are kindly requested to participate in a survey on this roundtable, the link for which will be made available in due course. And if you need certificate of participation, anyone, please mention it at the end of the survey. There is a last question which asks whether you need a certificate or not. If you say yes, we will send you a certificate in digital form. With that, now I request our beloved Dr. Father Jose, Pro Vice Chancellor, Christ University, and Director of the Department of International Studies, Political Science and History, to declare this roundtable open. Father, please.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Deepa Olapalli, Dr. Christopher Painter, Dr. Lata Reddy, Dr. J. Gullish, I don't know whether I pronounce it properly, sorry if at all I mispronounce it, Dr. Jurjit Pal, Dr. Manoharan, Dr. Madhumati Deshpande, respected faculty members from the department, and also from other campuses of Christ University and other institutions, students of Christ University and respected participants. At the outset, I would like to congratulate and thank Dr. Deepa Olapalli for her great efforts, sincere efforts in bringing this third round of, let us say, interaction or enrichment for the faculty members, scholars, research scholars, and other students of Christ family. Let me also thank and congratulate Dr. Manoharan and Dr. Madhumati for their great efforts in making this third round of, let us say, interactions. As we all know, this roundtable comes at a time when we find ourselves invariably connected to the digital network. We participate in this digital world if we are willing or not, because we live in association with others, with communities and organizations, all of whom have a presence online. Since this space is infused into public life, it can no longer be treated as a simple tool for communication. The complexity also arises because this intrusion is tied to innovation. As technology advances and we develop new modes of communication, data will have to be used. The question we ask to us is, who will be impacted and at what cost? Cybersecurity enters the picture here. It is not only a way to preserve what we have, but also to preserve the future of innovation. Having a discussion across borders allows us to be resourceful to each other and look at points of focus in both economies. India's digital economy is being revolutionized by entrepreneurship and polity, with e-commerce and e-governance becoming prime focus areas. The US, on the other hand, is a front runner in technology, with investments in advanced intelligence and cybersecurity. With both the countries maturing in the same space, there is benefit in cultural knowledge transfer through the dialogue that we will have even during this roundtable conference. By establishing a symbiotic relationship between the two countries through this roundtable, we can also develop a set of shared principles. Learning to treat data as information about humans, about citizens, that could have implications on national security, human rights, and international relations is a perspective we have to look at today. We have among us scholars and professionals with specializations in different fields like cyber policy, information technology, strategic relations, and more. Their insights will help us to understand the different levels at which we can come together and collaborate. We are in a defining period that will change the future of digital operations with India-US relations at the center. Let's hope that this roundtable will inspire the young generation to exchange ideas across boundaries and lead the charge and the change to digital transformation thoughtfully. Thank you very much. With these words, I'm very happy to inaugurate and wish you all the best.
Thank you, Father, for that inspiring note. Credits to you also for your excellent leadership and constant support for making this initiative a success. May I now request Dr. Deepa Ollapalli to take over the proceedings. Before we proceed, I would like to quickly introduce Professor Deepa M. Ollapalli, who is Research Professor of International Affairs and Associate Director of Cyber Center for Asian Studies at the Elliott School of International Affairs, the George Washington University. She currently directs the Rising Powers Initiative, which tracks foreign policy debates in major powers of Asia and Eurasia. She is a specialist on Indian foreign policy, India-China relations, Indo-Pacific regional and maritime security, and comparative foreign policy outlooks of rising powers and the rise of nationalism in foreign policy. Ollapalli is the author of 5 books, including Worldviews of Aspiring Powers, published by Oxford in 2012. Her current research focuses on maritime and regional security in Indo-Pacific and is writing a book on big power competition for influence in the Indo-Pacific. She has won grants from Carnegie Corporation, MacArthur Foundation, Smith Richardson Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, and Asia Foundation for a work related to India and Asia. Dr. Deepa also has held senior positions in the policy world, including USIP and National Institute of Advanced Studies. Over to you, Dr. Deepa.
Thank you so much, Professor Manohar, for that kind introduction. We are really here to hear from others, and I want to again extend my welcome to all of you and say that my co-conspirators, Professor Manohar and Professor Madhumati, have been extraordinarily helpful in pulling off this event. And of course, Dr. Father Jose, thank you so much for that rousing welcome and your visionary leadership, which I have seen over and over again. Your support for this project in particular is much appreciated. And I'm delighted to hear about the new Center for East Asian Studies that has just been established at Christ under Professor Manoharan. And I understand that the center is going to give special emphasis on the southern states and their various links to East Asia. I, for one, welcome a little less Delhi centricity in Indian foreign policy, and I wish you well in this important endeavor. Well, as Professor Manohar said, this roundtable is part of a broader project targeted at the younger demographic, the millennials and the Gen Zers of India, studying international relations. And just yesterday, we published the results of a survey that we had done after one of the earlier events that we did with Christ and GWU. And we published that in a report that is, you can find the link to that in your chat box. And it really is all about what the millennials think in India as the key convergences and divergences in US-India relations, broadly speaking. We got some great reviews of it already. Speaking of surveys, today's event is actually a result of a survey, which we asked the attendees what they wanted to hear more about. And these two topics, cybersecurity and digital media, digital economy, and how these issues affect US-India relations were two things that they wanted to hear. So we're responding to popular demand here. I won't go into any detail in this topic because we're here to discuss them. But of course, these topics are affecting us every day, and yet they're very complex and technical. And so I think most of us would like to hear more about, how it affects us and what are the policy implications of these that are not readily apparent. So I am thrilled to say that we have assembled, as you've seen, a absolutely terrific group of experts to walk us through how cybersecurity, digital media, digital economy figures into the bilateral US-India relations, and to tell us what their views are on how these two countries might collaborate or not. And I'm so grateful to these very highly sought after speakers who have taken the time today from their busy schedules to join us. So let me you saw their quick bios and titles, but they deserve a longer introduction. So let me just give a brief, longish introduction here. For the first session on cybersecurity, we have Chris Painter and Ambassador Lata Reddy. Chris Painter, as you heard, is the president of the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise Foundation and really a world leader on cybersecurity and cyber policy, diplomacy, and combating cybercrime. He has been at the forefront of US and international cyber issues for over 25 years. First as a prosecutor in some of the most high-profile cyber crimes in the country, and then as a senior official at Department of Justice, the FBI, the National Security Council, State Department, and White House, really a dizzying number of high-level places. He's really, let me just say that he's America's top cyber diplomat, and he has also been very involved in negotiating several landmark cyber agreements internationally. One with regarding the theft of intellectual property with China, and for our purposes, a comprehensive cyber cooperation agreement with India. He's also done other international agreements to reduce the risk of miscalculation in the cyberspace that could lead to conflict in that space. Let me now introduce, I'm going to introduce all four speakers at the same time. Our second speaker is Ambassador Lata Reddy, someone who really needs no introduction to this particular audience. She is one of India's most illustrious diplomats and someone I'm privileged to call a good friend. She's co-chair of the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace and the former Deputy National Security Advisor of India, where she was responsible for cybersecurity and other national security issues. She's also served as a commissioner on Global Commission on Internet Governance. And Ambassador Reddy brings a wealth of expertise on strategic issues and has worked extensively on strategic technology policies, especially on cyber and cyber cooperation and internet governance. In the Foreign Service, she has held several very high posts, including in DC and as ambassador to Portugal and to Thailand. I can't think of really two better speakers for the cybersecurity session. For the second session on digital media and digital commerce, we have Mr. Jay Gullish and Dr. Jerajit Pal. Jay Gullish, he leads the U.S.-India Business Council's Digital Economy Committee, Media and Entertainment Committee, and Privacy Working Group. He has promoted digital development in more than 20 countries for over 25 years. Most recently, he served as a digital policy officer at the U.S. Embassy in New Delhi, covering a variety of areas, including cyber, telecommunications, and information technology. He has also previously worked in India's outsourcing industry and has actually lived in India for over 5 years, so he's very familiar with the country. And last but not least is Jerajit Pal, who is associate professor at the University of Michigan. He's actually calling me on the phone, but let me finish him before I take it. Before he was in his position currently, he was a principal researcher at Microsoft Research. He looks at social media and political communications in India, especially on political branding online. And he has, I should mention, one of the interesting things is that he has researched and produced the award-winning documentary, which people in the audience will appreciate, called For the Love of a Man, based on the fan following of South Indian film star Rajnikant. So that, I think, is an additional credential to him. Again, two outstanding experts that we are fortunate to have. So now we can turn to the main event. But before we get to the panels, just a quick word on the format. The speakers, I've asked to give them to give about 7 minutes or so of remarks. And then following that, we'll have 20 minutes of discussion and Q&A per session. And I'm delighted to say that we have a group of 14 very motivated student discussants who will lead off with questions, 7 per session. We'll also try to get to the audience questions during that time as well. Well, okay, we are actually running a little late, but that's to be expected when you have so many illustrious people on the panel. But let me now turn over to Chris Painter to kick things off on cybersecurity and give his take on the biggest bilateral convergences and divergences from an American side. And then we'll turn to Ambassador Reddy. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, and it's great to be with you all today, virtually, sadly, but still great to be with you. And it's great to see Lata, who was someone I dealt with a lot in government, but also after government in the Global Commission, and Jay, who was at the time, my person in India when I was at the State Department. So good to see both of you. With respect to convergence and divergence, a couple of general comments. One is, it's really, with respect to India, it's not a binary relationship. There are a few issues where there are diametric divergences. It's really a range of convergence and divergence over all these issues I'm going to discuss. And it's grounded in a couple of things. One, India and the U.S., I think, share common values. And so there is this basic of, two democracies sharing values really across the board. And there, yes, again, there are some divergences within that, but I think that's the grounding. But there are also geopolitical issues. India has long been leader of the non-aligned countries and a member of the BRICS, which includes Russia and China, of course, but also has close ties to the U.S. So there's some tension there in terms of how the countries have dealt with each other historically. And we have been dealing with each other historically on ransomware for many years, for the years when I was in the government and continuing afterwards. The main areas I wanted to talk about briefly in terms of convergence, one is the issue of combating malicious ransomware or ransomware. This is one of the big topics that have come up recently. It's a form of cybercrime. It could be either state-sponsored or by criminals or criminals acting at the behest of a state. It has really captured the news recently. I was a co-chair of a ransomware task force that issued a report on this just before on the big ransomware events in the U.S. But, as we looked at that in that task force and just looked at it generally, India is one of the worst victims. The U.S. is obviously one of the worst victims as well, but India is, of all the APEC countries, the highest level of victim. There was a survey done by the cybersecurity firm CrowdStrike that said that 3/4 of the organizations in India, at least the ones that they surveyed, had been hit by ransomware with an average payment of about $2 million. So that's pretty significant. And ransomware, to the extent you know or don't know it, is particularly malicious because it disrupts the operations of an organization, whether it be a government organization or a private sector organization. And it involves both disrupting their organization, extorting them for money, but also extorting them a second time, threatening to release the information. So it could be very damaging for organizations around the world. And here, I think there's some real chance of convergence in terms of working together. And indeed, the U.S. and India have talked together on this. There was a summit that was put on by the White House in the U.S. On ransomware that included 30 countries. And India was part of that summit. And they reached an agreement, high-level agreement, a statement that came out of how they were going to go about this. Obviously, it's very complicated implementing that. But to get an agreement with India and the U.S. As part of that group, I think was really significant. So that's one area of convergence. The second, I think, is in the general area of critical infrastructure protection and cybersecurity. This has been a discussion between India and the U.S. for quite some time. And in August of 2016, we reached an agreement, a really large agreement, which was a framework for U.S.-India cyber cooperation and its relationship. And that had many different parts, including cooperation on technical issues, cooperating on policy issues, making sure there was better communication between the country, working on norms issues, multi-stakeholder internet governance, which was an issue between the two countries before, but now both kind of agree on that as well. CERT to CERT, which is Computer Emergency Response Team. These are the technical folks in each country who respond to threats. We've had a long history of cooperation between those entities. We've had MOUs between them. And so that's been very important. Now, like everything else, this is shaded. There have also been areas of tension and conflict. I think India has oft complained that they haven't been getting enough information from the U.S., particularly through the search channels that they wanted. But that's natural. Those kind of speed bumps are sort of natural. But I think that's an area for both those two areas are areas not just for existing collaboration, but I rate them high for future collaboration. On the areas of divergence, again, these are all shaded. So one is on supply chain and 5G issues. The U.S., as I think most folks know, was pushing very hard for countries to not, to basically ban Huawei and other Chinese equipment makers' equipment in their 5G networks. India came out and said, look, I think their national security person on this a couple of years ago said, look, we have to be careful about the source of equipment, obviously, but at the same time, we're also worried about, we can't just forego 5G because we need to catch up. This is an economic driver for us. And so we have to understand the security concerns, but also the economic and other concerns. And so was reticent to get involved. And there are other ways to deal with 5G threats other than just equipment bans. There's things you can do for untrusted networks. There Palo Alto Networks and others have been working in this area for a while. So it's not just about the equipment, but the equipment has been sort of the geopolitical issue. Again, I think that's shaded because just recently, I mean, back in May of last year, India essentially banned Huawei from its broadband network, or didn't ban it, but did not accept it as one of the trials at that time. So this is an ongoing issue, I think, as we go forward. The second area is the area of collective action and joint attribution, particularly when the malicious actors are seen to be China and Russia. And I think this goes back to India's relationship of both with the U.S. but also with China and Russia as part of the BRICS, and not wanting to be on the bad side of either of those relationships. So when the U.S. and many other countries have done joint attribution statements blaming Russia or China for activity, India has been reticent to join in on those or take actions, and I think that's an issue as we look forward to accountability, how we're going to deal with that. Now, there are two areas quickly which I'll hit on where I think there's a chance of greater convergence as well. One, but also a history of divergence. So one's on cybercrime. For many years, the U.S. has pushed what was called the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime. It was negotiated in the framework of the Council of Europe, and many non-Council of Europe states were involved in it as the basic treaty, basic international instrument. India has been resistant to that, particularly because it wasn't at the negotiating table for that, so found that unacceptable, although they looked at it at various points. So that there's now, I think, a chance for more convergence because there was a UN negotiation on this after many years. So I think, again, because of common values, hopefully there can be some convergence there. There's part of that cybercrime issue is access to data, and this has been a big issue for India, where U.S. providers hold the data of a lot of Indian citizens who use those providers, Yahoo, Hotmail, etc. And this has been a major source of friction where India wants to get that data, but it's very difficult to get that data because of U.S. privacy laws. There have been things that the U.S. has done to try to work on this generally, something called the Cloud Act, which allows countries to be able to go directly to the company providers, but it requires an agreement between the two countries, and that requires a certain level of due process from the U.S. perspective, which I think has caused some challenges. Again, there may be some room to look at this in the UN and other frameworks, so we'll see where that goes. And the last thing I'll mention is on norms of behavior and international stability issues, where the UN has been working on this for some time. And the history has been the U.S. and India have actually collaborated on this, although there's been differences, but have collaborated on what the norm should be, what the rules of the road should be in cyberspace. The bigger issues of where we go next, accountability, et cetera, and how this will play out in ongoing UN forum, where I think there's both a chance of divergence, but also a chance of convergence. So with that, I think I used my 7.5 minutes. So, and I'm happy to go into much more detail on all of those. And with that, I will rest my case.
Chris, thank you so much. You've set a good example. Let's see if the rest of us can follow that. And so with that, I will turn it over to Ambassador Reddy.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Let me begin by saying that I agree with Chris on the convergences. I see cooperation on ransomware, protection of critical information infrastructure, cert-to-cert cooperation as definitely as potential areas for successful cooperation. On divergences, I would somewhat disagree, because my own feeling is that the major area of divergences would be on data localization. I see this as a very major issue because, there are many ideological and structural differences between India and the US. India's push for the data localization and India's divergent views on data sovereignty and what they call digital colonialism is definitely an issue. I think the law enforcement agencies not getting access to data is another area of, or not getting ready access to data. The MLAT, or the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty, under which we can seek information from each other's law enforcement agencies doesn't work well. And Chris and I have wrestled with this problem for many years, both in government, and we've talked about it outside of government. And I think that this would certainly continue to be an area of differences. But the question is there a way to speed it up? I think that on data localization, US technology companies have lobbied very strongly against these data localization requirements that India would like to see introduced because they see that as putting their companies under Indian control to a certain extent. India's personal data protection bill is a source of concern. India wanting a new data model for the global south is also a concern because what India has suggested is that there should be a fourth model apart from, let's say, the US model, the EU model, and the Chinese model, which should be a model that would be applicable for the global south. I think any Indian rules on data collection, storage, processing of data, and transfer of data will impact citizen and consumer privacy, national security, and economic growth. So I think I completely agree with Chris that the US has US and India need to have a bilateral Cloud Act agreement or something based on a Cloud Act agreement. And it's a pity we didn't start the negotiations on this earlier when America had actually expressed interest in this. Because I think, the same kind of issues would arise even if you did have an agreement, because after all, the US and the EU didn't agree on the privacy shield, for instance. But I think the question is, will the US government be given the right to access data from US companies on grounds of national security when the Indian government will not have the right to access this data even for their own Indian citizens from those very same companies? This could be a sticking point in negotiations. But I think the main issue is that India sees the economic value of India's data going to the US rather than staying with India. So how we overcome this is a real issue. I've already talked about the MLAT process being frustrating and the cumbersome procedures that we have. I think social media platforms, again, a lot of the big social media platforms are run by the US or US companies. A huge area of concern for India. The 2019 draft data protection bill, is very important from this point of view. And honestly, I think the Indian government has dragged its feet for too long on this. And the quicker they do come out with a final bill, the better, because there's too much speculation and there's a lot of, how shall I put it, tensions being caused on this, both between the India and the US and with India and other countries. I also would like to talk a little bit about some things which I see as solutions. I think the solutions I see are not just having the Trade Policy Forum or the ICT working groups, but I think we need to have a separate forum for achieving quick, tangible results rather than look at the high-level strategic outcomes. They can later, of course, be taken up by the Trade Policy Forum or others. And I'm sorry, I'm going a little bit into the economic digital areas, which I know the second lot of panelists are going to take. But as we mentioned in our earlier discussion, these issues do tend to overlap a lot. certainly the Cloud Act agreement or something based on a Cloud Act would be a very good solution. And clearly spelling out what India intends to do about its own data protection, I think is important. And finally, the actual cybersecurity of the data. What precautions will be taken to store that safely, both in India and in the US? You know, whether it's locally done or whether it's internationally done. On supply chain resiliency, I think perhaps the way to go is to use the Quad mechanism. You know, that's one solution. Could be work to reduce barriers in specific areas on health and digital services. Could be look at mini gains or mini trade agreements like reinstating GSP, which is something India would very much like for certain goods. Could we find common ground on emerging non-traditional issues which affect supply chains? Could we improve Indian programs to attract manufacturing units, but with safeguards? When India, and another important issue which I shouldn't skip is that when India aims at China, at blocking Chinese investments, it also sometimes inadvertently affects US interests because there are US companies operating in China who would also come under that category. And then investments could be delayed. In fact, they've talked about investments being delayed up to, I think, the value of $6 billion pending approvals, perhaps based on this issue. And finally, I think we need to use fora like the CEO forum, which we have not used effectively in the past, to try to overcome some of these issues. So there are a lot of recommendations, and I should also very briefly, if I have a minute, Deepa, just talk about what has been the history of US-India cooperation on cyber issues. 2001, we set up the US-India Cybersecurity Forum. 2006, unfortunately, the beginnings of real cooperation got disrupted due to an espionage issue. So from 2006 to 2011, we went to a dormant period. 2011 was when we set it up again, firstly with a MOU between the DHS and what was then called the Department of Information Technology. 2011, Chris and I both participated in what was the first, what we call the all of government dialogue, followed by India coming out with its first cybersecurity policy in 2013. And of course, the real progress was shown by 2016 when the framework for US-India cyber relations was negotiated and set up. And I think that the framework works on norms, it works on critical information protection, and it works on not allowing theft of intellectual property. It works on telecom security, and it works on CERT-to-CERT cooperation. So I think we need to use the framework more effectively. So I think I've come up with some solutions, and I look forward to more discussion with the participants in this forum. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lata. You both have given, this is the, as practitioners, you give an insider account as well as an analytical take on this, so much appreciated. And now it gives me great pleasure to turn to our students who have been waiting. And I should say that these are students who are from Christ University, postgraduate students, but they all come from different parts of India. We have students here from Assam, from Kerala, from Maharashtra. So you really get a good cross-section of the Indian millennials. And as I said, they're highly motivated. They've done a lot of work on coming up with the topics to interact with you all. And let me just say what I'm going to do. There are 7 who have identified for this group. And I'm going to start with two of the students so that you get two questions, and they will say, I think, who they're directing it to, which panelists. And now, as Ambassador Reddy said, there is a lot of overlap, and we'll be going back and forth, but that's fine. I think what it does is it'll sharpen these issues as we go along. So let me start by asking two of the students. The first of all, Johan Cherian, he's a second-year MA student, and then Salkar Gaurang, who's also a second-year's master's in international studies. So over to you, Johan, and then Salkar, and then we'll go to the panelists.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir and ma'am, for your very insightful, in-depth discussions on the topic. So my question is directed to Christopher. So you mentioned about ransomware, and I think one thing that you didn't mention was the issue of how cryptocurrency is being used by attackers on various infrastructure and in the recent days. So one way that I see from an economic perspective, how you shift the use of cryptocurrency will be to de-incentivize the use of cryptocurrency. Cryptocurrency does have its use and has an advantage in terms of traceability. But is there a way by which, beyond the regulatory framework, we can de-incentivize attackers from using or demanding cryptocurrency? And just one more question, and what will be the role of future developments in this technology in terms of central bank digital currencies? Is there a possibility of development that side and to counter cyber security threats? Thank you, sir.
You have to unmute, Professor. You have to unmute.
Yes, please, Salkar. You please ask your.
Yes. Am I audible?
Yes.
Thank you very much for that insightful section. I have a two-part question directed at both the panelists. So it starts with, do you see the formation of a new 21st century Westphalian cyber social contract among states? And then reflecting on the institutional norms-based approach, do you see India leaning towards a more Sino-Russo model of sovereignty, or India is leaning more towards a US norms-based approach that is basically authoritarianism or universalism or authoritative universalism? Thank you.
All right. So I think I will call on Chris first, then both of you can take the two. As you can see, the students give the hardest questions.
So cryptocurrency, we identified this as in our report as one of the key enablers of ransomware. And indeed, the reason ransomware has exploded is because there haven't been many consequences for the actors, and it makes them a lot of money. And they use cryptocurrency as the vehicle of choice to be paid. So, of course, you have to look at cryptocurrency as an enabler of criminal conduct. But cryptocurrency, I think, is here to stay. We're not going to, I don't think any country is going to ban cryptocurrency. More and more are actually endorsing it. So then the question is, well, how do you deal with it? And I think there are two things we do. One is what we recommend in the report, which is that countries around the world, including the US and India, need to apply existing regulatory regimes, know your customer rules, for instance, anti-money laundering rules to cryptocurrency, like we do in other areas. That requires a real political commitment by both countries. And really, it's not just any country issue, it's a global issue, much less like we dealt with any money laundering many years ago. So I think it requires more work there. I think there's also things the U.S. Treasury has done and sanctioning certain crypto, not providers necessarily, but transition points, wallets, etc. So we need to look at that as well. And I think that's an activity of joint action. I don't think, the criminals are incentivized to use it because it's harder to trace. But if we can actually get some of the money back, which we've done recently, and attack that system without destroying cryptocurrency generally, I think that's the way to go. On the second question, I'll start, and then Latha can add. She may have something to add on crypto too. Look, I think that India and the U.S. are more aligned on the norms-based approach. I mean, certainly we've agreed to that in the UN setting. There's this divergence of, we feel that you have to look at the actual end goal. So you can't really have an arms control treaty for cyberspace because what is a cyber arm? These are software. They could be for positive and negative reasons. They could be for both. They could be for network security reasons, but they also could have offensive uses. So looking at the effects, like don't attack the critical infrastructure of another country, don't attack the certs of another country in peacetime, and having the applicability of the UN Charter and international law and when you're in actual conflict, which fortunately we haven't had yet. So I think that there's common ground there. I think that the idea of absolute sovereignty that Russia and China promote is not where I think, and you guys are more expert than I, where India is going, because that has human rights and other dimensions. Because they try to control all information, view information as a tool of threat in itself, and that has profound human rights and even economic dimensions. So speaking from my perspective, I think the U.S. and India are closer on that than far apart. But I'll shift it to Lata as well.
Thanks, Chris. Let me talk about the second question. I think that I completely agree with Chris that India and the US do have shared democratic values, which you said in your opening remarks. And as a result of that, we do agree on a norms-based approach. When it comes to Russia and China, I think you have to regard them both as two separate entities. And India's approach also would be very different towards the two of them. Russia has been a trusted defense partner of India for many years. And there, perhaps the US and India do have divergences. But when it comes to China, it's definitely an adversarial relationship. So, I don't think you can lump it together Sino-Russian. It doesn't follow in the case of India. I agree also with Chris that in India it would be very difficult to go in for the sort of totalitarian, absolute sovereignty approach of either Russia or China, because India has a thriving civil society. We have very well informed young population, such as yourselves. And I don't think completely suppressing freedom of information or allowing people not to have access to certain platforms would go down well at all in India. So I think overall we have a better chance of collaborating closely with the US than with the Sino-Russian model, as you call it. And I would see that we would cooperate better with a norms-based approach. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, thank you for those interesting questions. Let me quickly move on to the others. I think I'll take 3 questions this time, just so that to get it out there. These are 3 from all first-year MA students, and we'll start with Tejasvi Shukla, followed by Jairam Prabhu and Unnamalai Lakshmanan. Go ahead, Tejasvi.
Thank you so much, Professor. First of all, at the outset, I'd like to thank everybody because it was a really insightful discussion, and I'm actually privileged to be a part of such an expert panel. My 2 questions, the first one was actually answered by Ambassador Reddy previously, but I'd like to throw it again to Dr. Painter, because I really wanted to know about the US approach of why is it so difficult to dehyphenate India and Russia relations from the India-US combined defense against China, because Dr. Painter anyway mentioned in the beginning of his address how India and US, are actually victims of Chinese attacks, and there is a possibility of convergence, provided that there is no dehyphenation so far that is taking place explicitly, at least from the US side. If that goes on, my question is the recent, for example, Quad experts group that was created on cybersecurity. How is that going to function with these divergences continuously existing? The second part is about the divergence that exists with respect to supply chains and 5G, again mentioned by Dr. Painter. Sir, this same thing was also thought about after the pandemic hit the world. We thought of shifting supply chains out of China. Quad and Quad Plus, all of them were brought in. But given the dependency that the global economy has on China, I mean, Apple is forced to cut its expenditure, cut its plans, because it's not been able to access semiconductors. The monopoly that China has on rare earths. India's maximum imports actually are Chinese electronic equipments. How are we looking at creating alternative supply chains, and how possible is that, sir? Thank you so much. That's my question.
Lata, do you want to go first this time, or?
I think I'll let Chris go first.
Chris, go ahead. Go ahead, Chris.
So I do think the U.S. disaggregates or dehyphenates, as you say, China and Russia. I mean, they're similar in many of their positions in forums like the UN and other places. However, they do pose different challenges and different threats. And, I think, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can understand there are differences in their motivations, differences in the threats they pose. I think, China is more of a longer term challenge. I think when we're talking about, they're less disruptive and more, more focused on industrial and other kinds of espionage, where Russia, I think, has been more disruptive, at least for the U.S. And so that poses challenges. So, I do think it's a challenge, but we can cooperate on China issues. I still think we can cooperate on some Russia issues too. One of the people in the chat asked, how do we work with states who are not cooperative or rogue states? I do think it makes a difference on certain issues, like providing a safe haven for ransomware actors. That whoever the country is, whether it's Russia or some other country, we can act together. So I do take your point. I think it's worth disaggregating that. On the supply chain issue, that's a hard one. We should never be in the position again where there are only two places where you can buy equipment. We need to have multiple places. That requires more research and development. That requires, I think, even joint action between the U.S. and India, the U.S. and the EU, all of these entities, to create alternative supply chains. But also think about not just the supply chain issue, but are there other technical things, and I mentioned it when I had my remarks, that we can do to secure an untrusted environment. So, and I do think we need to look at that too, because as you say, supply chains are difficult. Components come from everywhere. And if you want to have trust in the systems, you have to have several different layers of approach. And the last thing I'll say before turning over to Lata is I do agree on, I do think the data localization issue is a big issue. However, I don't think it's a panacea. I think simply localizing data has also very negative consequences in terms of economies of scale for companies, even India companies, if they're forced to do that in other countries as well, looking into the future. So I don't think data localization solves it, but I do think it's an issue we need to deal with. So over to Latha.
Okay. I'm not going to address the first point on dehyphenating, Chris, because you've already addressed that. On the second point on 5G, it's interesting because I actually wrote a paper on this, on the 5G question, and how that could become the core of a special kind of arrangement where countries could come together and collaborate to make sure that we don't get caught in the kind of supply chain dependency that we were. And effectively, I completely agree that we need more research and development. We need more joint initiatives by several countries coming together rather than being dependent just on one source. What's happening in South Korea is very interesting. What's happening with Nokia is very interesting. And I think that there are things happening in Scandinavia, particularly, which could provide solutions. But I think the most important thing is that we don't become dependent on any one source ever again, on anything that is of essential value to digital connectivity.
All right. Now we have, thank you both. Now we have two last questions that I'm going to take. This is from Jagriti Sanapati and Jeshil Samuel, both second year MA students. So, Jagriti?
Thank you, Dr. Deepa. My question is directed to Ambassador Lata Reddy. There are underlying tensions and competing agendas within cybersecurity strategies. And also in 2013, we saw the target breach, which costed millions. Ambassador Reddy, you mentioned about the Quad mechanism in one of your recommendations. What sort of geopolitical implications do you see India dwindling with if the mechanism were to be applied? And how does this help resolve the third party involvements in supply chains? Thank you.
I think that the IoT dialogue under Quad recently announced that some of the issues which could be, it's a very ambitious agenda, by the way, on the IoT. They talked about ICT, 5G and 6G networks. They talked about telecom infrastructure. They talked about critical technologies. We talked about artificial intelligence, quantum computing, machine learning, cybersecurity, and semiconductors. So, I can see that there would be a lot of areas where we could talk on this. And so I don't see us losing in any way by cooperating with the countries of the Quad. We already have a very good bilateral relationship with the US. We have a good bilateral relationship with Australia. We've got cyber cooperation agreements with most of the Quad members, or all of the Quad members, in fact. So why not? I think if the Quad can be brought in as an important factor, we should use that.
Let me just intervene for 1 second. I want to make sure. Actually, I realized Jairam and Unnamilai, I called on you, but I don't think we got the questions. Did we?
No, ma'am.
No.
Okay.
Apologies for that too. Yeah, is ma'am still answering, or can I continue with my question?
I'm done. Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
You-
Apologies
so
for that once again.
Please add. Yeah. Thank you. Sorry about that.
Thank you to all the speakers for the very insightful session. I'm sure everyone attending would have gotten a clear insight on how India and US can collaborate on cybersecurity and what are the divergences that they can come over. My question is directed towards Ambassador Lata Reddy. One thing I observed was in the recent Union Budget of India, there was heavy mention on moving to digital infrastructure. We have gone into so much of digitization thanks to due to the pandemic, and we are also moving into cryptocurrency. However, there has been minimal mention of cybersecurity in general, whereas in the US there is a dedicated cybersecurity budget that's allocated to just deal with cybersecurity. So what is your opinion on it, and how do you think India can improve on those things? Will be my question.
I think there is budget.
Sorry, Lata?
Sorry.
Can I just, because in the interest of time, I need to collect the other questions for you and Chris. So I think we still have two left, is it?
Am I audible? I'm Jairam. I am asked to ask my question. Yes,
Jairam and then Jaishal.
Am I audible?
You're very
Yes.
soft, Jairam.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, speakers, for the wonderful session we have had. So my first question is to Christopher, sir. How can US support Indian startups, especially in the field of cybersecurity, in its technical side? And the second question is to Lata, ma'am. How can we use new age technologies like AI, ML, Internet of Things, etc., for safe and secure cybersecurity practices? Thank you.
Okay.
Is that everyone?
Oh, ma'am.
Jaishal?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
I have two questions. I'll try to keep it brief. The first one is to Mr. Chris. So you spoke about norms, international norms, right? But what about states like North Korea, who in general do not respect international law? Just because we bring an international law, that is not going to deter them. So what can the US and India do, both who have been affected by North Korean APTs and hackers all the time? What can we do other than taking legislative measures, what are the other measures that we can do to deter rogue state actors? And my second question is to Lata ma'am. Ma'am, this is a problem that both India and the US have been facing. We have certain institutions in our countries like hospitals, educational institutions, charities, and even in India in particular, we have a lot of medium-sized enterprises who do not have the budget to, have a proper cybersecurity to implement proper cybersecurity measures. In that particular condition, how can the government help these particular institutions? Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir.
Whoever wants to start.
I could go first if you like.
Okay.
Deepa.
Go ahead.
Answer one question, which I think was Jairam's, on IoT, machine learning, AI. How can we use these for cybersecurity? I think that they are likely to throw up more problems for cybersecurity than solutions. Because obviously, in the Internet of Things, you'll need a lot of legislation to see that there's some minimum cybersecurity observed by companies who are producing items that are going to be used under the Internet of Things. And on artificial intelligence, perhaps there's more of a scope because, there we could use certain aspects of artificial intelligence to make cyber security a little more effective. For Jeshal's question, I would say that on hospitals and educational institutions, again, more regulations by the government to ensure a basic level of cybersecurity for hospitals, health facilities in general, and for educational institutions, since we've all become that much more involved and dependent on online mechanisms. And I think, was it Namalai who talked about the budget question? Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I would say that why we haven't made a specific provision on cybersecurity is because, it would be the responsibility of different agencies, and each agency within its own budget would have provisions for beefing up its cybersecurity requirements. So, for instance, I can tell you about the foreign ministry. The foreign ministry certainly would devote a certain amount of its budget towards beefing up cybersecurity and making sure that things are in place. So I don't think it's necessary to specifically have cybersecurity budget as such. I think what is important is that the message goes out at the highest level of government to everyone that you have to put cybersecurity as a high level priority and penalize the private sector and the institutions that I was talking about in the previous example to make sure that these safeguards are implemented.
All right, just a couple things on I'm no expert in the Indian budget, but just one comment that one of the struggles I think we had for many years is having cybersecurity being treated as a no kidding national security priority, even within government, and mainstreaming it as a national security and economic security priority. And even when you're dependent in the US on individual agency budgets, that often isn't enough. They need a push from the White House or from the Prime Minister's office to make sure they're actually devoting funds and attention to this, and a little bit of a stick to it if they're not. So that's just the way it is in the US. I can't speak for India. On AI, AI can be really good for cybersecurity. Lots of different cybersecurity firms are building that in to anticipate, rather than having these things you've had before, firewalls that have specific signatures of attacks. They anticipate new attacks, and I think that's going to be the wave in the future. But the bad guys will also use AI to automate their attacks. So it's going to be a sort of a little arms control war going on there. On the issue of how can the U.S. work to help India startups in cybersecurity, maybe Jay can talk more about that as an economic matter. Obviously India has to create that environment first and foremost. But I think things like joint research and development can help with that, and that was something that was agreed to in that U.S.-India framework, for instance, from 2016. And on the norms issue and outliers like North Korea. Yeah, look, norms are for the good guys in a sense. You say, here are the norms, here's the expectations of behavior, and if you transgress these, there needs to be consequences. We've not been that good at that part. We've not been that good at actually accountability and consequences for bad actors, whoever they are, including North Korea. And so we need to not just use individual tools we have, whether they be economic sanctions or other things that we can do, which we've done with North Korea, but we need to act together on those issues and make life uncomfortable for them, and use all the tools we would use in the physical world to try to persuade them to change their conduct and to go after the groups who are causing this. And as you know, some of the groups in North Korea don't only act from North Korea itself, but act from other countries to benefit North Korea. So I think we need a concerted effort there. There is a problem with that a little bit. North Korea is a bad actor in lots of different areas. So you only have the same tool set for all those areas. So, nuclear probably is much more important than cyber, even though I care about cyber deeply. But, we need to use those tools in a smart way and work together to sanction those activities, and even get countries who support, North Korea, like China, to be more involved, because I think ultimately it hurts them too. So I think there's a lot more we can do there. But more broadly, I think we need better accountability in cyberspace, not just rules of the road, but accountability for violations.
Thank you so much. We've had such good questions and such thoughtful answers. And I think we were simply trying to be, I see that I was being overambitious here, but I'm going to, with that, thanking all of you, all the participants in this session. I'm going to now rush to the second panel, which is even more diffuse topic than this one. And there again will be some overlap, but Jay Gullish is going to talk more about digital economy, e-commerce, and media. And then Georgieet is going to focus more specifically on social media. And I can already see that I'm may have to ask for a little extension in the time, which I hope won't be a problem for the second set of speakers. But without any further delay, let me turn it over to Jay Gullish. And thanks again, guys.
Well, thank you so much. I want to thank the organizers, and it's a real honor to be on this panel with such high quality, not only the questions from the students, but also the other speakers. I can stay late, so if you want to build in some extra time, please feel free there. Before I go into sort of my pre-prepared opening remarks, I just want to reference a couple of things that both Chris and Lata already mentioned, because they're so insightful, and they really mentioned ways that the US and India can work together going forward. They cited Cloud Act and access to data, the movement of data around cross-nationally, cross-border data flows is also a critical issue. But a couple of things that I just want to add that I think are really important. And up front, the good father mentioned this idea of culture. And so much of the cyber realm misses the cultural aspect of it. We talk a lot of technology, ones and zeros, and we talk policy, but we're missing that so much of the digital age is culture. It's social media. It's this layer that older folks don't even really understand, and that it's about influencers and trending and a whole variety of applications that are always new to the game. And so pulling in that cultural aspect is really critical. And so in addition with the technologists, we actually need people that are psychologists, understand how people react to information. We also need social trendsetters to be part of this conversation. And that's how we think about this holistically. We need to include that cultural piece, which I think is very often missed in a lot of policy and technical circles. The second thing that I just want to share up front is that the United States and India have a bit of a structural difference. And so when you have these government-to-government conversations, they don't align clearly. In India, there are at least 3 digital ministries with no counterpart in the United States. And so when the governments get together, there's often not a lot of comparability in the way the governments are structured. We do not have an IT ministry or a telecom ministry or an information and broadcasting ministry. And so we're often find ourselves slightly misaligned in the way that our governments talk about some of these issues. And so I think that's an important aspect. And that's why one of the ideas that I've been discussing, and I love the idea of Cloud Act discussions and that point, but also, you know, there are other models between the United States and Europe, a Trade and Technology Council, and there are some other ways to think about that. But turning back to my segment in particular, let me just say that the opinions here are my own. They don't represent the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the U.S. India Business Council, or any of my members, and therefore I'm going to be really frank and straightforward with you all. I'm going to share my screen, and here we go, and hopefully you can see a few slides that I put together. And so I want to start by saying, you know, why are we here today? You know, one of these questions of why is it the U.S. and India really want to talk to each other in ways that are unique between the way India interacts with other partners and, frankly, the way the United States interacts with its other technology partners. And up front, there's a real unique synergy and scale in the U.S.-India technology partnership that is truly unique on planet Earth. We have in the United States a huge number of Indian students. We have a very strong diaspora. We also have in our corporate class and in our governmental senior folks in the U.S. government, a lot of Indian Americans that play a very critical role. Moving back to India, the United States has been very instrumental starting back in the 1990s with the Y2K and investing heavily in IT, and American companies as a result are heavily invested in India. And likewise, we're seeing a sort of an echo of, so to speak, where Indian companies over the last 5 and 10 years really have changed significantly their footprint in the United States. So Indian technology companies are hiring tens of thousands of Americans. They have operations in many, many states. And the way that they think about interacting in the United States market is really different. The last thing that I will mention is that India's startup community is really vibrant. I think India has the 3rd largest startup community in the world, but it's really critical to understand that there is a distinct American connectivity there. A lot of the founders either are Indian Americans or have an American experience. A lot of the money is going back and forth between VCs that are in many ways are binational. And a lot of the business plans and sort of strategies of these companies are data heavy, and they look at international markets. And the United States is clearly the largest market for India, including in the IT realm, where just by estimates, you know, there is probably, you know, $200 billion annually moving back and forth between the United States and India in the digital economy. I just want to restate that. Roughly $200 billion is moving back and forth. And it's incredibly diverse. It's not just in the traditional IT sectors. It's not just in the media and entertainment sectors. It's not just in the space and satcoms. It's digital health. It's across this really diverse set of sectors. And that deepness, when you tie in the scale and how synergistic the two countries are, not just from a government point of view, but from a capital, from a people, from a business, corporate, from a technology point of view, it really makes this relationship incredibly impactful. As I've said, you know, U.S. companies are heavily invested in India. There's at least 1,000 centers that are back offices, but they're doing products and services that are utilizing India's scale and its technical capabilities, and frankly, English language, and really using India to provide global services. So it's U.S. companies in India that are then servicing clients in Indonesia or Europe or even in Latin America. And so it's really neat to see that. And of course, the diaspora has a really unique element of this. And I've seen over the years, you can go to Silicon Valley in almost any US IT company and see the American executives. But more recently, you can go to Hollywood and start to see Indian Americans get involved in a lot of the new media entertainment and esports segments that are fast growing. And so that diaspora and the emergence and the evolution of the diaspora is really a critical point. Myself included. My wife is Indian American, and so I consider myself a son-in-law of India. We're from Kanpur, and I speak a little Bhojpuri, but don't ask me to share what I know because it's mostly a little bit slang. And then the final piece I'd like to share is that, in India itself, is that, Prime Minister Modi, I think he needs to be congratulated by his real visionary push on digitization across Indian society. But it's also equally important to note that American companies and technology and capital are key elements to realizing those goals, and that the diaspora is very much connected with those. So one thing to sort of note is that while there's clear synergies going both ways, after the more recent elections, so in Modi's second term, there's been a slight change and perhaps increased focus on things like, self-reliance and perhaps data localization and more regulations. There's also a push for Indian standards and technology and stacks and things of that nature. And a lot of this is okay, but it also creates a lot of concerns about where it's going and how far it goes. And frankly, where's this balance of protecting and promoting your own market and your own objectives, but making sure that you're working with your trading partners so that, you don't kill the goose that laid the golden egg, to use that sort of trite term. And so we're really at this critical time right now where there's dramatic changes in how technology is being regulated. And there is no one clear answer. And we in the United States are having similar issues as well with how to handle cyber and privacy and those other things. The one thing I would say is that as India and the United States develop these models, it is critically important that we don't separate the two economies, because there's so much interaction, there's so much money and people and technology and ideas going back and forth, that whatever structure we come up with, it needs to adequately represent
1 minute,
those
please.
positive interests. Of course, balancing as well the needs of some of the geopolitical aspects of the anti-China coalition, access to data, and strategic technologies. So with that, I'm going to stop my remarks and hand that over to Deepa. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to hand it straight away to Dr. Pal. Again, if you can, I'm sorry to ask you to be as concise as possible, just to give the students time. I think you need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, no problem. I will be as short as possible. I have to say that I have a hard stop in 15 minutes after the scheduled end of the event. I pushed something back. I will have to leave at that point.
Okay. In fact, let me just say that
going to
perhaps
go ahead.
within 10 minutes after we'll stop. Yeah, if possible. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Is my screen visible?
Yes, yes.
All right, excellent. Okay, so I'm going to go very quickly here and just give you an overview of what's happening with social media. Much of this is good knowledge already, and just giving some points for discussion. What I'm going to do here is very different from what all the other scholars here have done. In fact, I'm neither a legal scholar nor a bureaucrat nor understand business terribly well. I study large scale and small scale data, and I'll go into that a little bit. It's delightful to be here, not only to be with such fantastic panelists and really sharp students, but I'm also glad because we've had great interns from and grad students from Christ in the past, so it's a real honor. Okay, so there's the obvious with social media in India. India has a huge number of social media users. We're looking at 500 million plus active users of social media on WhatsApp and YouTube. And of course, there's a picture of Narendra Modi from his Instagram feed, and really the person who revolutionized the use of social media in politics, not just in India, but globally. I mean, even though the global studies of social media are really focused on Western leaders and what they've done, like the way that Modi went about using social media, the drivers of what he did and why he did those are really, really important case studies for that. But what's also happened is that social media has become a critical form of interpersonal and media to citizen communication. Yeah. There is the obvious of what is happening with social media. India has 10 Instagram users with over 50 million users. Virat Kohli is among the top 10 most followed people on Instagram today. Students might be amused to know that T-Series, the company which actually started its business on piracy essentially, is today the #1 YouTube channel in the world. There's a number of folks here who have listed who are, say, the top person on their respective channels in India, and India is the #1 or #2 by user base on social media on a range of social media today. Not so much on revenue, but we'll get to that in a bit. The less obvious is that social media has gone from being something which was highly centered in a small English-speaking elite to really broadening its reach, not only English-speaking elite, but also urban young elite, to now being something which is broadly used in rural areas. There are a number of rural influencers, which was actually credit for which goes to TikTok, which once it was closed, then moved on to other channels, including Instagram and YouTube, and a number of now non-traditional, if you will, influencers, such as Ravi Bala Sharma, who's a lady who does dance stuff on Instagram. Number of people in various fields, electronics, travel, etc., who talk about what is happening in those spaces through social media. People who really didn't have a way of being publicly seen in the past. The less obvious also is that India is now the world's second most important market as far as online hookup is, and in India, of course, that includes the matrimonials are concerned. So it is a massive market on more than one front. And the problem here is that this kind of setup leads to friction, right? So like I said, India is the #1 user base for Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Snapchat, #2 for LinkedIn, and #3 for Twitter. That pretty much covers the spectrum. And when there is some kind of a situation which brings the government into conflict with one of these platforms, that ends up being very, very testy for the reason that the companies have a very strong motivation on the right side of the government, the country, which is such a large source of revenue, especially as coming in as outsiders in this case. Now, this is a tweet here from Amit Malviya with the BJP talking about the problems with big tech having an oversized power in society. And at heart of this is that what we've seen with social media and the way social media is governed on speech issues is that it is driven by the discourse often in the United States of what counts as free speech. Is really at the heart of it is First Amendment, and even though this is private corporations which have laws and I'll have rules, and I'll get to those in a second. on what counts as free speech and what counts as defamation or against what the platform stands for. When that is challenged, that becomes an issue at the governmental level. You see two cases here, one from Republican Matt Gaetz, who called for violence against Antifa, which is a loose anti-fascist group of folks in the States. And one from Sambit Patra, who is a BJP politician, who posted something which was then found out to be untrue, and both of these were challenged. And the challenge to Matt Gaetz went largely, at least from a legal perspective, there wasn't much done. But in the case of Sambit Patra, when that was challenged, the office of Twitter was raided, and you know, I was working in big tech at the time, and I remember at the time is that nobody wanted a job with Twitter or Facebook to do these kinds of things, which would bring you into conflict with government, because it's just not worth the money that you will make for the consequences that might come out of it. What is also important is that censorship is increasingly also driven by an active publics. So cases are when Zomato went into conflict, quote unquote conflict, with a section of Indian social media users when it decided to not go with religion-based delivery of food, which is that you can't ask for your food to be delivered by a person of your religion. And they stood by that, and eventually this led to a lot of cancel calls. And likewise, what we've had right now actively happening in the US is where Joe Rogan, very, very popular podcaster, has been in some conflict with other musicians who want to be deplatformed or have him deplatformed based on his views on well, not his views per se, but on material that comes out on his podcast related to COVID. And the interesting thing in both cases is that there is a financial decision to be made. I have 1 minute left. All right, so there's a financial decision, and essentially, what we're looking at is there's a public versus there's government contesting these things, and there's publics contesting these things. Now, community standards of what it will and will not remove. There is one here which specifically relates to India, which is the Dalit, the description of Dalit or scheduled castes as menial laborers. That is something that Facebook will regulate, but for the most part, it does not regulate a lot of speech in India, and that has been a point of major conflict, especially given that a lot of the misinformation or hate speech might often originate from sources that are friendly to one or another political side. So, in a nutshell, this is my last slide, and we are seeing right now an active situation where the US or agencies and individuals speaking for the US are in conflict, if you will, with an Indian state position or a legal position, which is on rights of women wearing hijab going into schools. And there are 4 points here which I think are important that could be points of discussion. First is the governance of corporate policy against national law. We've seen this in the IT Act in 2021. The fallout of communication past diplomatic channels when these kinds of things happen, where in this specific case, Ilhan Omar's tweet and governments get involved. But the political management of crisis situations, and finally managing the differences in free speech approaches, where the U.S. is still is driven largely by the Section 230 style of thinking of publishers as distinct from tech platforms, And these are 4 key issues which I'm just going to throw out there for people to think about, and I'm happy to take questions. You can always email me because we're short on time, and I'm plugging a conference we are having on influencers, which is free, and you should join it. Okay, there we go.
Well, thank you. We've got fascinating 2 presentations right now, and there's so much here that I'm going to ask, with everyone's permission, to extend it until 10:45 when Jayajit has to leave. So with that, and with my apologies for having to do that, let me now quickly turn it to the students who have been patiently waiting. And I'm going to take, out of the 7, let me start with 4 questions. So this is a big ask of the 2 speakers, but here you go. So take notes. All right, so first we'll start with Hanspreet Kaur. She's a second-year student. Sakshi, a first-year MA. Vishnu Prasad, second year. And Shivam Tiwari, first year. So please do that in that order and direct your questions to whoever you want asked, and hopefully we'll get through this. Hanspreet?
Thank you, Dr. Deepa. So my question can be answered by any of the professors. My question is, it's a little different from what we have talked about in this session, but it's about that the pandemic world has seen a digital convergence, but it has also led to rise in infodemic, which was a new term coined, especially in regard to the COVID-19 pandemic and the spread of fake news, especially in context to the diseases. And it has also been found out that it has somewhere or the other impacted the policy making formation. And so my question is, what are the collaborative measures that India and USA could take to limit the impact on policy making and political communication that is being caused by the spread of infodemic or might be caused by some other factors in the future?
Sakshi? Hello, Sakshi there?
Yeah, so my question is, it's related to information warfare. So information warfare has jumped from traditional media sources to the online world, catching many technology companies and governments off guard. And we have seen Russia and USA have engaged in digital warfare on many occasions, which has polarized perceptions. So my question is, has this hostile digital information warfare conducted by these states led to a greater clarity in foreign policy, or has it created more misconception of a country's position? Thank you.
Vishnu?
Thank you. My question is actually directed to both panelists. So it's about the great deal of influence that US digital media exerts not only on India, but across the world. For example, it influences how people people in a lot of countries view the rest of the world. India doesn't have much of a media presence in Moscow, and whatever news we get on Russia comes from Western media outlets. And a lot of them are usually biased. So my question is, given that they wield so much power, do you think that the American media has a bit more has a responsibility to be a bit more objective than maybe what they actually are?
And finally, Shivam.
Yeah. My question is directed to Dr. Pal. And my question is, India wants to cut big tech down to size for various reasons, from tackling fake news to preventing monopolistic practices. Why do you think India is becoming less accommodative towards big tech? And how does India's homegrown platforms such as Goo, Bharatam, and ShareChat came into this picture? Yeah, thank you.
All right. Thank you. Who wants to go first? Jay, do you want to take some questions first?
Sure, I'm happy to. I'm going to go in reverse order. And Shivam, I know you didn't ask me this question, but I think it's important to note. This is common in new technologies that expand really rapidly. You have a centrality of them, and then over time you have competition and it becomes a much larger pool. I'm of the age I remember when America Online had the first 100 million email accounts. Now it's a company that doesn't even exist, and something like ISP and internet access is much more competitive. And I suspect that over time, you're going to see platforms in the social media space, whichever one you want to pick, they're actually going to be a diversity of different platforms. You're going to start to see people self-select. You're going to see new regional and local innovations, and it's going to be a much harder world in a way to sort of regulate content, because you can't just look to the top 5 platforms that cover, 95% of interactions. In the future, there's going to be 500 platforms that control, a total of 40%, and it's going to be a much different dynamic. And that's where I think this issue of maturity comes in sooner or later. And I think a lot of the issues that we're dealing with now will find more traditional channels of regulation and interaction to deal with them, whether that's traditional competition regulation, traditional libel regulations, or those sorts of things. And it'll be a very different way of how we manage a much more diverse set of information exchange. Vishnau, on the issue of US influencers around the world, this has always been sort of, I say, a canard. People always used to say that Hollywood sort of drove this vision of what America looked like and impacted values and so forth. And so soft power is really critical. But you can go to Los Angeles and elsewhere and you see that it's not just the United States. The Japanese and South Koreans have a lot of influence as well. And I think as this diversity of sources come out and actors that maybe weren't as proactive in the digital space, newspapers and such, and radio stations become more active, I think that issue of sort of a monolithic or a uniform influence, I think, is important to note. It's also clear that there's nothing monolithic about the United States, and so if you want to find, content that has very different viewpoints, you could find American platforms or international platforms as well. This goes back to culture. We all can decide to watch the BBC or CNN or any other channel. And so we need to be proactive as we ingest information. There's this assumption early on in the internet age that all information was accurate and true. And now we know that's not true. And so we need to take it upon ourselves also to be critical of the things that we read. We need to find those sources that we trust over time and sort of change how we think about it individually, and that will have, I think, collectively an impact, where we won't just, oh, I saw this WhatsApp message and it must be true, and therefore go do something that we wouldn't necessarily want. I guess Shalisha had a really great question on information warfare, and this is where I mentioned up front this cultural aspect. When the Russian government got involved in the last US elections, it just wasn't providing information, because governments have always provided information or propaganda in positives and negative ways. But they clearly understood how social media worked. They had influencers involved. They had people on the ground that really understood what people were saying locally. And it was a much more social media campaign than it was a cyber hack. And it goes back to up front when I mentioned it's really critical that when we think about cyber, that we just don't think about the ones and zeros, that we don't think about the rupees and dollars. There's so much psychology involved in here and social trending and so on. And so governments, if they want to be involved in information warfare, are going to go down that path. And then the recipients of that also need to respond and say, culturally, we need to learn to validate, those sorts of things. And I have a lot of personal stories about people sort of going, I could not believe that this person turned out to be a Russian influencer and they got me all ginned up on the elections. And you hear those sorts of stories, and it's sort of this tale of, fooled me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. And we're really moving into that second phase where I think we're looking at everything with a healthy dose of questioning and its source and its ended up and where it's going. And I think Hans-Preet, you sort of mentioned the same thing. Yeah.
Just one point. Since it's we only have a few minutes left, I'm going to stop you for 1 second, and I want to get the other 3 questions on the table because before Jeji has to leave. I'm sorry to do this, but I want to make sure all the students get a chance to get their questions out. So let me just ask Judith Blessy, Kalpana Pandey, and Vineet Vinoy to ask their questions.
Thank you, Dr. Deepa. So my question is directed to Dr. Pal again. We spoke about censorship, which has been rampant in India in the past few years. And also, you also spoke about how recently the US big tech like Twitter, which was challenged by the digital media norms of the Indian government. So in this light, do you think the digital media censorship that is seen in India is acting as a deterrent in Indo-US digital cooperation? And if yes, as policy advisors or analysts, what avenues of digital media collaboration do you suggest? Thank you.
Kalpana?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. So my question is, India and the US are following equivalent to China's coercive measure, and which isolate its own online media from the remainder of the world. Rather than following the censorship paradox, being the democratic country, how US and India can be different while following the strategic digital policy, and how exceptional strategic digital policy can be embraced. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am. My question is directed to both panelists, and it's foreign policy democratization is something that is yet to be achieved in both India and the United States. In this scenario, do you think digital media can play a significant role in democratization of foreign policy? As we saw, the airstrikes following the withdrawal of the US troops from Afghanistan ended up killing an aid worker rather than the IS militants. And so there's been questioning of the foreign policy which has been taken under closed doors. Or will digital media be used as a tool for weaponization, which will in turn affect the national interests of the country?
Jajid, sorry, it's all yours.
All right, well, I'll go as fast as I can here. Sorry?
Pick and choose.
Yeah, so the questions by, I think, Shivam and Kalpana are sort of related, which is the question of coup and the local versus global. I personally feel that the question isn't so much local versus global, rather than what interesting platform has to offer. And if you look at every successful social media platform which has succeeded, Instagram came in with a certain visual ethic. Snapchat came in with a certain ability to move things around in the interface. Clubhouse, briefly good, came in with other kinds of other form of interaction, which then makes it a worthwhile thing for people to download. TikTok was perhaps the most important innovation in social media. So the challenge here is that you have to be able to do something exciting on the platform for it to catch up. Who, in my opinion, is not going to work. You can go ahead and quote me on it, and it's not going to work because it doesn't do anything different from Twitter. And the only way it will work is if the government bans Twitter, right? So that's one problem. You can't just say that because all these interesting people are here, so everyone's going to move here, unless those interesting people are kicked off from other platform, which is the 4chan, 8chan, Parler kind of stuff, right? The influence of digital media, Vishnu and Sakshi's questions again, I thought were very related. And the challenge here is that digital warfare is not just happening across states, it is happening within states. I mean, the kind of polarization that you're seeing in countries is way bigger than what you're seeing that country to country, because at some point the RT has to present itself as somehow reasonable to be more effective as a propaganda tool, whereas the channels within country don't have to, so you have much worse happening over there. Judith's question, is censorship a deterrent? Well, it is, but at the same time, there is enough money to be made that people will step past the censorship. And Facebook kowtowing to the Modi government is a great example of how the way that we'll have you not censor us is that we'll just say whatever you want us to say and censor only those who you want us to censor. And that becomes a problem only insofar as free speech is an annoyance rather than legal shortcoming. The last question that I can deal with is the pandemic fake news. I'm afraid the democratization of foreign policy isn't something I can talk about. The pandemic fake news, I mean, the problem there is that it is a balance between what is a politically expedient thing for a country to do versus what is the correct thing as far as the health process is concerned. In this, I see things somewhat more in black and white, as I would in terms of climate change, is follow the scientists. I think India did well in this case, that even though there was a clear effort to make a certain community seem responsible for elements of the pandemic, the government didn't move back from saying that, okay, here is what is the correct thing to do, and then you should move about doing this. Whereas US really faltered with that until the Biden government, the Biden administration came in. And of course, you're going to see other situations like Canada and so on and so forth, where this is going to be a problem. Yeah, those are kind of half-baked answers, but I'm sorry, that's the best I can manage right now, given the time, right? So thank you very much. I unfortunately really must leave.
Thank
Bye.
you. I know you have to run. Again, with everybody's permission, Jay, I'm going to give you the floor for just a couple of minutes.
Sure. There was a lot of great insight there. I mean, the one thing I'll say is about foreign policy, having done a stint, governments are particularly bad at social media. There's a clearance process, there's a particularity of how words are used, and therefore it comes across as being very stodgy and not very clear, and so you have these sort of formal use of social media, and then you have the more informal use that might be called information warfare. Governments are never going to be the leaders in this. They're always going to be the followers. Governments are always going to struggle to regulate new technology. Governments need to respond to the foibles or the problems. And I think that we're starting to see how this new post-privacy digital economy is evolving. We're not there, but there's elements of consumer protection. There's increased elements of privacy. There's increasing policies about how user-generated platforms actually self-regulate. And I think that early on there was not a willingness to self-regulate, and now there's a clear understanding that there needs to be some self-regulation. And then there also needs to be this accountability piece, and that's going to end up in the courts for the most part. And there'll be libel cases, and there'll be other criminal cases where unfortunately things will happen because of social media. But that's really normal. If you were to go back and look historically at new sectors that do things dramatically different, whether that's railroads or telecommunications in the early day, or cable TV in the early day, or internet access in the early day, it takes governments and their people as well some time to figure this out. And so I'm really optimistic. I mean, there's clearly lots of issues we need to learn and deal with, but day after day we're getting a little bit smarter. Day after day, the real influencers are thinking about what they say. Joe Rogan, who was cited, he considers himself a comedian or an entertainer in some way, and he's actually apologized for some of his comments. And I don't think he would replicate saying the same things over and over again. People learn. So the way we all interact online is also changing. People don't necessarily say things in a chat that they wouldn't want out there because they've been burned about a personal experience or some other sensitive information or some other political or even business cases. And so I want to end where I began, in that this cultural learning is such a key part of this. And when I look at you all who have been asking questions, I mean, you all are the ones that culturally are going to need to learn and figure this out. We can help apply some wisdom or experience or some regulation, but it's really how the younger users are using it and how that informs not only the platforms, informs governments and how to regulate. And so I'll end there, that it's really I really always focus on the cultural aspects. It's easy to focus on the ones and zeros. It's easier to focus on the regulation and the dollars, but this culture is really a critical aspect of the digital economy going forward. And so there's a challenge for all of you here to think about how should we be, using these tools for the benefit of humanity and society and economy, but also balance it with the other needs to protect those same communities and to ensure that governments can do what governments do.
Thank you, Jay. That's a great way to end on the note of looking to the younger demographic here to help lead the way forward on some of these really complicated, fascinating questions that we're all facing. And I want to say that I'm so proud of all the students here, and thank you for their very thoughtful questions and comments. My apologies, but my thanks for everyone staying beyond the time. I hope it was worth the extra minutes, but we cannot end without a formal vote of thanks. So I'm going to quickly turn it to my colleague Madhumati.
I'm going to take much time, but the breadth of the topics covered have actually floored me. So I'm still reeling under what all came out of here. So respected panelists, my dear colleagues, respected father, Dr. Deepa, who's been the backbone of this project, and all the panelist students who have had the most interesting questions. Thank you all for a very broad discussion on digital media and cybersecurity. Many people do ask us, how do you social scientists get into this technological area? And this workshop or this roundtable is the answer to that. There are so many different issues that come up because of policy making, because of the cultural differences, as Mr. Jay pointed out. And the two practitioners, Dr. Ambassador Lata Reddy and Chris Painter, who have been in this policy making, gave us a brief about what goes on behind the doors, behind the government, as to how do we navigate this new technological space, which social scientists earlier never had to deal with. But now we have to, and thank you both for giving us that policy background and the way to navigate the governance and administration of this new technology. As Mr. Gullish kept pointing out, the cultural differences that come between US and India also threw up these questions, and I kept thinking to myself, if students can ask these questions, I'm sure the governments are already involved in trying to solve these cultural differences that they already have. So it takes a lot of effort in bringing out that, bringing out a convergences in the policy making for both the governments. So thank you for touching upon foreign policy, on censorship, and on, from all the way to political science, all the way to policy making. Everything was covered in this roundtable. So thank you very much for your inputs. And thank you for participating with us and answering our students' questions. I'm so glad I'm not the one answering those questions anymore, and I had more help here. So thank you. And Dr. Deepa, I can't thank you enough for bringing these two topics. I think we need to have a bigger conference and a longer meeting on these two topics with the breadth of the topics that we covered today. So thank you all, and thank you for the great evening that we had today.
Thank you for having me.
I forgot to mention, I have to thank the Department of State for at least giving us this opportunity to conduct these conferences. We have two more, a couple more that are scheduled to be held in this year. Hopefully one of them can be offline, but otherwise, we would love to meet everybody online still. Thank you very much. Good night. A good day for all of you.